start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land, the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to any Aboriginal people who are here with us today. Our theme is connection, connecting the city, and we're asking the question, what is the city's role? What is the tall building's role within the city? What are we connecting? I think we should be connecting people with the ecosystems that we inhabit. So I'm on the same page as you, Luke. That connection is probably reconciliation at some level, and that we need to remember that we exist in relationship with the land. We also need to remember that connection is a two-way street, that there is give in the equation as well as take. And the main thing that I want to talk about today is that give part, because to say that out loud sounds a bit obvious, but I think there's a reason why we got to that forgetting. In Western thought, we've created a pattern to understand called take it apart and put it back together again, that by understanding the components, ye shall know a thing, which is fine as far as it goes. It helps you understand that a stomach digests food, that it secretes acid to break down the stuff that you've eaten into something that your body can use as fuel. But if that's the limit of your understanding of the stomach, you won't notice that it plays a vital role in our nervous system as well as a signaler of fear. And that's a really important contribution that the stomach makes to your body. I think we think about buildings in a similar way, as components of a city in isolation from each other, and that has led to two unfortunate results. So we've made some incorrect assumptions about the way buildings are and what buildings can do, and that's created a blind spot when it comes to what they can contribute as part of a system. So let's look at the first thing first. What do we think buildings do? So we think a tall building stands alone. It certainly gives the impression that it does, but we pretty much know that it doesn't. It needs to get its resources from other places through a network, which is another way of saying that it relies on the generosity of others for its survival. So in a way, it's kind of like an infant. It needs to have everything brought to it, its food, its water. It even needs to have its waste taken away for it. So I think what we're really saying is this, that a tall building makes messes and takes stuff. And we don't really make demands on tall buildings. We don't expect very much of it in terms of giving back. And the reason that I know that that's the case is if we look at the language of our expectations around buildings. So here's some of our targets for building performance that we commonly use. Notice both what we measure and how we express the measurement. Behind these words are our expectations that whatever we build will take as a fundamental condition of its being, and whatever we build will produce junk that someone else will be responsible for dealing with. So what conclusions can we draw about what we'll get if this is what we expect? Well, a scarcity mindset excuses tall buildings from any obligation to give. If there's a limited supply of stuff, then the best I can be expected to do is use less. And if it's always been this way, then I can define my current performance based on past performance, because it will always be this way, which excuses me from having to make any real radical change. And the result is that we discuss how to be less bad. What a narrow and depressing trajectory. How limiting, right? And how does this square with the desire for ever taller buildings? Not well. So I imagine this is a conversation that for the most part you avoid having. So it kind of sounds like we think of tall buildings like that really obnoxious friend who refuses to notice the impact that his behavior has on you, that we expect him to show up late, we always get to pay for the coffee, and that nothing is going to be contributed to the conversation. And it stays a crummy relationship if we don't ask for something different. So if we go back to what we're saying we expect now, and if we said, that's not right, that can't be right, that's not what we want, what if we said instead that tall buildings have something to contribute? Well, the first thing we need to do is turn away from self-referential models that lock us into unproductive modes of thinking. So I'm sure you saw that quote coming. We need to find new ways to think about and talk about what success looks like. So we need a different benchmark, one that will really stretch us, one that will lead us to some breakthrough thinking. And the good news is that the benchmark is all around us. It's right in front of our face, really, and this is the lady that has led the movement to point it out. This is Janine Benyus, biologist, author of Biomimicry, and founder of the Biomimicry Institute. Biomimicry's goal is to create products, processes, and policies, new ways of living, that are well adapted to life on Earth over the long haul. The core idea is that nature has already solved most of the problems that humans are grappling with. And after billions of years of research and development, what surrounds us is the secret to survival, which is that to be successful, you have to operate in alignment with nature's overarching system design requirement, which is to create conditions conducive to life. So how can tall buildings do that? What do they give to the system at the moment? Not very much. So does that mean that there's unrealized potential here? I think absolutely. So what we need is a biomimetic mentor for a tall building. I imagine you saw that coming too. A single very tall tree can do several things. It can provide habitat, it can provide shade, soil stability, carbon sequestration, and air filtering. And if we look at some of the specific characteristics that trees and buildings have in common, both tall trees and tall buildings have a reasonable amount of surface area. Trees developed that area so that they could maximize their solar absorption capability for photosynthesis. Could tall buildings do something like photosynthesis as a metabolic process in service to the ecosystem of the city? Turns out they can. So this building uses light to eat smog and generate electricity. This is the Palazzo Italia in Milan, and it has biodynamic concrete panels which capture air pollution when the envelope material comes into contact with light, and transforms that into inert salts, which reduce the smog levels in the environment. It also uses photovoltaic glass and photocatalytic concrete cladding extensively so that it is capable of covering its energy needs autonomously from the sun. But how about harvesting water? The leaves of sacred figs channel water off their surfaces by this unique shape called a drip tip. And this is the Hawaii Preparatory Academy Energy Lab. And its roof faces the upward slope of the hill that it's nestled into, so that as the morning dew rolls down the mountain, it can collect the condensate in the tray along the bottom edge. So that's pretty good, right? So a single building, like a single tree, can do a few things, but if it's connected, what else could it do? This is a particularly relevant example for tall buildings. This is an emergent canopy tree in a rainforest system, so it has other trees around it, but it expends its resources to get above the canopy. And what it gives back is that it brings those nutrients back down into the soil to nourish the immature trees around it. So in the context of the city, could tall buildings offer very low rent to social services in its lower floors, subsidized by the higher floors up top? Could it provide homes for other species being edged out of their environment due to development, like hawks or cliff-dwelling plants? Could we provide atria, terraces, and roof gardens to allow humans the opportunity to be outside without having to travel all the way down to the ground plane? And I know the answers to all these questions is yes, because we've seen some examples even in this conference about buildings doing this sort of thing. But if we want to talk truly connected, if we want to talk truly successful, dense models of life, this is the potential that I really think we're talking about. In a rainforest, the variety of species is stunning. So a typical 10 square kilometer patch of rainforest contains as many as 1,500 flowering plants, 750 species of trees, 400 species of bird, and 150 species of butterflies, all interdependent, and the overall system resilience is improved by that interdependence. Anything in this system must contribute to the benefit of the whole, or it is selected for extinction. And anything in this system must offer to its participants something that no other participant in the system provides. So to survive, it must become integral, it must become indispensable to the others. So if tall buildings were to think like trees in a rainforest, what would happen then? So I think at a very simple level, tall buildings give shelter, and if they worked together, they could be a weather shield for outdoor plazas, or we do this sort of thing in agriculture with trees as windbreaks already, so it's kind of obvious. That tall buildings collect sun from very high up. There's at least a portion of their height that is never in shade. So if they worked together, they could collect power at all times of the day and bring those nutrients back down to ground level like a rainforest canopy. They also collect wind from very high up and even along their length through the sort of canyons of the city. And could we gather that as well to make an even greater contribution? And once we've brought those resources back to the ground, could we give them over to a shared network? So these are mycelium. They're giant networks of fungi underneath the forest floor connecting all the trees. And each tree brings its nutrients and water down to the ground plane, and then the mycelium portion it out to make sure that all the trees in the forest are fed. If we used this as a power supply model, with a diverse ecosystem of building uses above, could you meet your power supply needs, or at least a substantial portion of them, from within the city limits, without the substantial transmission losses that come with our current system and without emissions? If we did this sort of stuff, could tall buildings prevent irreversible climate change? Yeah, very possibly. So this is Ed Masria talking in Seattle last year about the impact of the building sector on emissions and our progress against the 2030 target of zero emissions, which Luke just mentioned a minute ago. So if we get to zero as a world target by 2050, climate change is still reversible. To do that, the building industry needs all new development to be zero emissions by 2030. Talk about being indispensable, right? Talk about giving back. That's our potential. So what if we aspired to that kind of contribution? What sort of metrics would we need? Come on, there we go. So how about these? What could we give back? How do we make things better? Here's a tool that can help you frame that conversation. So the Living Building Challenge is the world's most rigorous standard for building performance, and its benchmark is the flower. So it uses nature as the ultimate measuring stick for building performance, and it looks to create buildings that have a living relationship with their place. They're beneficial. They're not less bad. They're not neutral. They are positive. They're regenerative, restorative, and they have a beneficial impact on the places where they're constructed. So what does the Living Building Challenge measure? A lot of these categories will look very familiar to you, but what's revealed in these words is a different kind of expectation. The objectives that they express are what good looks like. And you'll notice a couple of new measures in here. So there's beauty and equity. These metrics acknowledge that buildings are part of our society, so we need to measure them in these dimensions as well. There are 3 types of certification. If you're fully certified, you meet all the requirements of the Living Building Challenge, so there's 20 imperatives there. Partial certification is rewarded with petal certification. And then net zero focuses on about 4 specific imperatives. These certifications are awarded upon demonstration of 12 months of continuous operation, not what's been submitted on drawings. The Living Building Challenge encourages system thinking because it's fundamentally based on our need to be connected to our ecosystem as a matter of survival. But it also incorporates biophilia, which is the love of nature, the idea that our health and well-being is fundamentally based on being in the experience of that connection. It also recognizes that sometimes the best solution can't be achieved within the property lines of your project, so it encourages you to look for partners. If outside of your property line there are people that you can connect with to make your solution work, that's great. It's called scale jumping. And if you scale jump to the point where you need to include an entire district or a community or a city, we have a framework specifically for that called the Living Community Challenge. Okay, so let's look at some buildings that are doing this. So this is the Omega Center in New York, and no, it's not a tall building, but it is a perfect example of the kind of mind shift that I'm talking about. Has anybody seen this building before? Do you know what it is? It's a sewage plant. Right? So who would have thought that a sewage plant had this to offer? An interior so beautiful that people come to visit it. Now this is not landscaping, this is the water treatment facility. So this is a living machine, it's a series of tanks with different combinations of living things in each one to transform raw sewage into drinkable water. People do yoga in it, okay? So this is the kind of extraordinary answer you get when you ask the question, how can I become indispensable to this place by creating conditions conducive to life? This is the Bullitt Center in Seattle. It's a speculative office building that runs on solar power. And yes, I said it's in Seattle, which is on the same line of latitude as London, and it runs on solar power. And we have a lot more sunshine in our neck of the woods. Just putting it out there. Okay. This is the Brickworks project in Melbourne. This is Fraser Properties' project to create the most sustainable retail center in the world. Now, these buildings are part of a hopeful vision of the future, where we are reconnected with the ecosystems we inhabit, and that it is a connection that is so healthy and robust that we not only survive, we thrive. And if a flat pancake kind of building can aspire to this level of performance, shouldn't tall buildings be doing this too? And to think for just a moment at the sort of policy making and city scale, if connection is two-way, if we want this sort of behavior from tall buildings, how could communities and cities help encourage that to happen? So you could potentially give extra floors or extra density for projects that use less or give back. So I worked on a project in Adelaide many years ago where we did a deal that if we used 50% less water, 50% less energy, and used or generated half the waste of a typical residential tower, could we have twice the number of floors? And they said yes. So if we were going to take that further, maybe you only reward the extra density in the floors for projects that generate more than they need and maybe take on other people's waste. We could remove some barriers to our own thinking around resource sharing. So if we have buildings that have cogeneration plants or other energy production capability and find themselves in a situation of abundance and want to share power with their neighbors, what could cities do to encourage that to happen rather than creating regulatory barriers to prevent it? And then very simply, we could offer faster building approvals for buildings that are pursuing things like Living Building Challenge, which is what the city of Seattle currently does. So to go back to our friend Janine for just a second. So Janine, being a biologist, thinks on longer time horizons than we do. She thinks in geologic time. And she talks about this idea of the adjacent possible, which is the idea that I'm allowing for the possibility of some breakthrough in the future based on what I'm doing today. So an example would be when plants decided to metabolize carbon dioxide and release oxygen, mammalian life was made possible. So adjacent possibilities can be huge things. So I guess the question that I put to you is, what is the adjacent possibility of tall buildings? What is the conversation that you want to have with generations yet to come? What do you want to be remembered for? Do you want to be remembered as the world's tallest building? Or do you want to be remembered as the project that changed the way people thought about what tall buildings could offer? We, all of us in this room together, have an essential role in this. We work on projects that cannot go unnoticed. They are beacons. They are symbols of cities, of countries. What do they say about what we value? And is that the story that we want to tell? Higher density does not mean that we must accept diminished results for our comfort or the resilience of our natural systems. We have enormous power to do less bad or to do good, to engage in conversations about stasis and singularity or about innovation and relationship. Often the construction of tall buildings is seen as an act of ego, a demonstration of our cleverness in defiance of gravity and the laws of nature. But if we're so clever, why don't we up the ante? Why don't we ask more from these monuments and set out with the intention to design an urban ecosystem that serves us as well, as resiliently, as generously, flexibly, and beautifully as a rainforest? Now, I've been quoting this movie for years because I haven't yet found anyone who says it better. So I'll leave you with this line from The Gladiator. What we do in life echoes in eternity. Please make it count. Thank you.